Hi. Welcome to Someone Else's Movie, the original podcast where an actor, writer, director, or nebulous industry figure gives a little love to a movie they didn't make. I'm Norm Wilner, senior film writer for Now Magazine, and this is the other thing I do. My guest this week is Greg Sestero, an actor and producer you probably know best for his role as Mark, Johnny's best friend, in Tommy Wiseau's cult drama The Room. Or maybe you know Greg for the book he wrote about that experience, The Disaster Artist, My Life Inside the Room, which was made into a movie by James Franco with Dave Franco playing Greg. I first met Greg when that film came to TIFF in 2017, and when Greg came back to town late last year for the screening of his new project with Wiseau, Best Friends, I jumped at the chance to grab him for this podcast. Greg wanted to talk about Ed Wood, Tim Burton's impressionistic 1994 biopic about the complex-driven Poverty Row filmmaker who gave us Plan 9 from Outer Space, Glen or Glenda, and Bride of the Monster, films that were dismissed pretty much as soon as they arrived in the world, but which clearly lingered in the mind of Tim Burton. Johnny Depp plays Wood as a sort of monomaniacal cheerleader, rounding up a repertory company of oddballs to bring his fever dreams to life, including Bill Murray's Bunny Breckenridge, Jeffrey Jones' Criswell, Lisa Marie's Vampira, George the Animal Steel's Tor Johnson, and Martin Landau's Oscar-winning turn as Bela Lugosi. Patricia Arquette and Sarah Jessica Parker play the women in Wood's life, and the whole thing plays as a love letter to one man's inextinguishable passion, however misplaced it might have been. So, I don't know, maybe you can see how Greg might make some connections there. This is Someone Else's Movie.
Ed Wood, I first saw it in August of 2009.
Really? Okay.
I got it on a Netflix DVD. That's quite a while ago. But I remember when it came out in 94. I didn't know really anything about Ed Wood. I knew Johnny Depp. And it was in the midst of The Room being discovered by audiences. So it started screening... What's that?
2009.
2009, okay, yeah, because there's an Entertainment Weekly article that came out at the end of 2008, so about 10 years ago, and it was all about the cult of The Room, and it was now screening in LA, and people would show up once a month, and over that year in 2009, it really started to get out there in New York and London, and so when I watched Ed Wood, I immediately identified with it, because you have this passionate filmmaker and this kind of eccentric friend that come together who have been pretty much rejected by the people in their life and the system, but they really want to make movies. Yeah. And so when I watched Ed Wood, I never forgot it. And so I had the idea to write The Disaster Artist, and immediately before I started writing The Disaster Artist, I told my co-author, Tom Bissell, I said, this story is very much, a modern day Ed Wood. Yeah. And so that's why it became a special film for me, is because I very much saw myself in these two guys.
Yeah. I don't know why, but I just assumed that you would have seen it the first time around. It must have played so differently for someone who's kind of been on the other side of that experience.
Yeah. I mean, it was almost like watching a big part of your story, but also watching it kind of later on, because I know in the film, the tragedy that happens with Bela Lugosi, it's almost like seeing your future in a way of seeing later in life of because both these guys, obviously, Ed Wood and Bela Lugosi, had passed on by the time this movie was made, so they never got to see really what happened with this film. But what I think is so great about Ed Wood is that the movie stands alone. I've never seen any of Ed Wood's films, really.
Really?
And I sat down and showed it to my parents. They didn't even know who Ed Wood was, and they loved the film. So it's really, it's just a great film with great performances, and it's a story, again, that's relatable. And I think that's what very much inspired me to tell The Disaster Artist in the way that I did. That it's not the story about the making of a bad movie. It's about friendship. And when I think of Ed Wood, he moved to LA from New York wanting to make movies. He had this secret that, I think he was okay with, which is something that I admire about that he was into cross-dressing.
Yeah, for someone who, in the 1950s, to be comfortable with that, too.
It felt like it didn't feel like it tormented him. It felt like it fueled him, in a way. Like, he was willing to embrace it, told his wife about it, I guess. Again, I read Nightmare of Ecstasy when I was prepping for The Disaster Artist, and a lot of stuff that's in that book isn't really in the film. But he comes to L.A. and the guy, I mean, he just went to work. I mean, he didn't really wait around for the phone to ring and be told, like, we want you to make a movie. He hustled and went out there and did so much more than people that have, per se, a lot more talent. But that's one thing that I thought the movie gets across really well is he does it with such an innocence, and he's so genuine about wanting to make movies. And then he got, in a lot of ways, very lucky to meet Bela Lugosi at a time where Bela was down and out and needed a friend and really just kind of wanted to work. And they were just such a touching pair, I thought.
Yeah, codependency, but in an almost heartwarming way. Certainly the way Burton presents it. And I remember when, in 1994, when the film came out, there was a great deal of simultaneously anticipation, because it wasn't that Burton had been talking about making an Ed Wood movie, but his influence is always so felt in Burton's other films, like this love of kitsch and the love of Vincent Price horror and a certain type that Wood never did very well, but always wanted to. Like, you always felt with stuff like Bride of the Monster and Plan 9 from Outer Space, he was giving you his version of whatever the big B movie was he saw at the drive-in the week before. And there's nothing original exactly about Plan 9 from Outer Space. It's aliens taking over the world and people walking around in cemeteries and all the creepy stuff that Ed Wood loved, but that Tim Burton loved as well. And you got the sense when Burton talked about Ed Wood as a person, as opposed to a project, you got the sense that Burton always remembered the movies a little bit better than they were. And then in Ed Wood, in the film, he recreates them exactly as they were, with wobbly tombstones and bad lighting and just the sense that everything is good enough, that just that one moment where Depp just goes, "Now we got it." And I feel such love for a type of filmmaking and a type of film in that movie that Burton, and the greatest irony of all is that Burton is working with a massive budget to realize this, certainly compared to what Ed Wood ever had. And he's giving us the pleasure of watching people invent stuff on the fly and make things up and just stumble through a genre movie before anyone really understood what the language of genre cinema was. And Burton, who, at that point in his career could do anything he wanted. He'd just come off 2 Batman movies. He'd made Edward Scissorhands, Beetlejuice, hit after hit. And Batman, I'm pretty sure that for a while it was the top-grossing film ever. Like until
the 1989 Batman.
Yeah, I think until Terminator 2 came out, maybe.
Yeah, which would be like in what, 91?
91, yeah. So he owned that for a couple of years, and then Batman Returns, it didn't do as well, but it did pretty well.
Yeah.
And Disney's like, please work for us. Here's some money. What can we give you? Because he'd had the relationship with them 10 years before. We
that's right.
With short films and worked on animation. And he said, I want to make a movie about Ed Wood. And in my head, he's Johnny Depp as Ed Wood. I want to do this now. And it's so weird and idiosyncratic and sweet in its depiction of this, this hack filmmaker and his morphine addict buddy. Like, if you boil it down, it's a tragedy, but there is almost no tragedy in Burton's film. It's kind of satirical, but it's also really affectionate, right? Like, it loves these people.
Yeah, it is. I mean, Ed Wood is really the ultimate indie filmmaker. And he would just do whatever it took to get a movie made. And so I really admired that, because when I made these Best Friends movies, you realize how tough it is just to get these scenes done. You need the people to show up on time. You need the location. You need the weather. So many things can go wrong when you're shooting, and they usually do. And it's about keeping that strength of being like, no, we're going to get this scene, and we're going to get it the best we can on this day. And so Ed Wood was really kind of the master of that, And I think the issue with Ed Wood, he had a quote that I really loved, and it's just keep on writing. Even if your story gets worse, you'll get better.
Yeah,
and
that's not wrong.
And I think he just put out so many films and novels, and I think really the issue with Ed Wood, I think, was being an alcoholic. I think really held him back as a person, because he was striving to do so many things, but I think he never was able to kind of grow as a person because of that vice. And I think that's what kind of held him back from building momentum, growing, and getting his work to be a little bit more to strengthen his work so it could be taken in a different direction.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the tragedy of Ed Wood. But I mean, you look at what he worked on, and it was like just things every month, every week. He was putting things out, completing things, getting these movies made, which is really tough. But just what I like about Ed Wood is that he, did it with a smile. He didn't have like the attitude and wanting to be taken this way or that way. He just did it because he loved to do it.
Yeah, and it's kind of Burton's whole thing in his storytelling, but it really did happen. He assembled this strange little repertory company of freaks and mutants and people who were sort of on the periphery of stardom, Vampira, Tor Johnson, and all these strange, not one-dimensional personalities, but people who could only be one thing based on how they looked and how they were. Lugosi had been trapped as Dracula for 30 years by the time they met? 35? And somehow it was never a stumbling block for Ed Wood. Mm-hmm. I mean, part of it, I guess, is that when you're working at that level, sort of Skid Row B-movie making, you're kind of a piranha, and you'll just grab whatever's in front of you and tear into it and make it work for you. But he kept finding ways to use Lugosi, Bride of the Monster and Plan 9. They're different. They're very different roles. I mean, Lugosi's barely in Plan 9 because it was reconstructed.
Speaking of that, I stole that idea when we made Best Friends Volume 2.
Really?
So after you see it, I'll tell you what we did. But it's very, very Ed Wood.
Is there a dentist running around pretending to be?
There's
somebody?
don't
spoil it.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where, for decades I knew Plan 9 as a joke, as the Golden Turkey Awards #1 movie, and Harry and Michael Medved wrote this book in the 80s and went before the 70s probably. Before home video, you would go to the library and read books about bad movies. You couldn't see them unless you were lucky enough to find them on TV one night. And so when I finally saw Plan 9, it could have only been a letdown because it was hyped up through all these retellings of how terrible it was. Oh, he got his dentist to impersonate him. The dentist was 8 feet taller, and it just sounded insane. And then you see it, and it's just like, oh, it's just silly and weirdly heartfelt. And then 5 years after that, you realize there hasn't been a month gone by where I haven't quoted Criswell's line, "Can you prove it didn't happen?" which is such an amazing, weird line to end a movie with. It's like, of course you can. There was no zombie invasion from aliens of Earth. But to go out on that, there's a certain beautiful innocence that, again, The Room does come to mind, where you're watching a movie made by someone who knows exactly what he's doing and has not articulated that to anyone else, or has not been able to. And with Wood, I think that was what happened. And Burton catches it here and there when he lets Johnny Depp be incredibly enthusiastic and the rest of the room just kind of goes, well, okay. And there's this little sag in the energy of the film where it's briefly tragic that no one else gets it, that he knows what he's trying to do and no one else can hear it. Yeah. It's like he's singing a song that only dogs can hear. But it's such a weird proposition, and I get why people would make those comparisons to Wiseau. And having met him last year on the Disaster Artist press days, I get it, right? Like he's really good at feeding into that image of himself because that's what people want, and he seems to have decided that he'll give people whatever they want now. But that couldn't have been the situation when you made the movie.
No, I think when you make a film, and what I think with most of the time with Ed Wood and with Tommy is they believe they're making like the greatest movie. Like they think people are going to watch these movies and really be just enamored and moved by each scene and be scared and be on the edge of their seat. And so when you shoot for the stars like that, you're either going to get something that is, incredibly bad or incredibly great. And so, but you're going to get a response. And I think that's what these two filmmakers have is because they're naive, because they really go for it, their films are watchable. Now the difference really with Ed Wood is back in the day, Ed Wood would just continue to go, and he never really waited to have a hit. He just kept making stuff, and I think Tommy kind of stumbled upon this thing with The Room, where all of a sudden, it became the midnight movie and the talk of the greatest bad movie ever made, and people were just flocking to it. So it put him in a predicament where he could just go on and make something else because it was just he was caught in this storm.
Well, and maintaining the legend of The Room is probably a full-time job at that point, in the first few years, right?
Yeah, because if you think back, like, let's say Plan 9 did what The Room did back then, I still think Ed Wood, Tommy hasn't made another film outside of Best Friends, which, is something I pitched to him to try to, because I think Tommy's at his best when he's being taken seriously, and I don't know if he at this point, if he could do that for himself, so that's why I was like, okay, let me step in and try to do something with you and try to take you seriously. But I think Ed Wood would have just jumped and tried to make like Plan 9-2, Plan 9-3. I think that's the type of personality he was. But it's just interesting that we never got to see what Ed Wood would have done with that fame.
Yeah, and it only came so far after the fact too that he's a cult figure, he's a cult hero now, but I think even in the 80s he was still kind of laughed at instead of laughed at affectionately. Yeah, it took Burton and Depp to
it took an Oscar-winning film to turn it around and make people appreciate it. But when I read Nightmare of Ecstasy, it was just really difficult, towards the end of how he passed away.
Yeah, he did not have a great life. Like the last 15 years were kind of a straight up descent.
Yeah, and just like him kind of his last couple days, man, it's tough. I know that exact spot in Hollywood where that happened, and every time I drive by it, it always reminds you of movie making in Hollywood and how it's so important not to have that be your fulfillment, because each film is a different story, and if you're looking to get your happiness from that, it's so unexpected. Like, you need to make the film because you just love the story and you want to put it out there, and you're able to move on and live your life and make sure you have like the right people around you and the relationships are what sustain you. But I think, fortunately with a situation like Ed Wood, just being an alcoholic and dealing with that, the void and the emptiness and the depression was just really tough because, he was really putting his heart out there. It's tough to not reward that, because I think he deserved it.
Yeah. And it is weird to go back and see the real filmography, the real history. I mean, he sort of spent his last couple of years making pornography and not the best pornography, if that makes any sense. I've seen Orgy of the Dead. It was released on VHS. It was recovered and restored at a point where I was reviewing everything that came out effectively. And so I saw it and it's like, yeah, that's an Ed Wood movie. It's, but it's really unhappy. Like it doesn't have the, it sounds dumb, but it doesn't have the pacing that his other movies have. That even when they're being they're stretching to fill time and sort of just coming up with more dialogue, there's an energy in a lot of his stuff. Glenn or Glenda has, just breakneck speeches, even though they're about crazy things, or Bride of the Monster or any of it. They're people working very quickly. You can sort of feel the energy.
Yeah. He believes in this. He wants to get it made. He thinks it's a masterpiece.
Yeah, and the actors too. They're a little rushed. They're going a little fast, as though he might call cut at any second, or they might just run out of film. And you feel the pacing. And Orgy of the Dead, not so much. It just felt like a bunch of things that were shot by a guy. There's no personality to it.
So yeah, and when watching Ed Wood, it always makes me wonder. How do you judge the filmmaker? Like, if you, with that kind of budget and that kind of limitations, and again, I know because I experienced it making these movies,
sure.
You're very limited in what you're trying to create. You have a scene, you have a couple actors, you have limited time, you're facing the obstacles of, the lighting's changing, getting everybody on the same page. If you hand Ed Wood $50 million and a first AD, and what kind of filmmaker is he? Or do you judge somebody with the bare minimum and see what they can make with absolutely nothing? I mean, can you think of a film, when you think back to John Carpenter's Halloween, 1978, I think the budget was like $300, which back then is still pretty decent, but it's a movie that's just been loved. Critics love it. Fans love it. It's still very watchable. Do you think Ed Wood, with a budget,
could have produced something like that?
Could have been a talented director?
I don't know. I think maybe all it would have taken would have been a tighter editor and a better cinematographer, and he would have been working a level up. I think by doing things the way he did and taking so much control of it himself, he probably did himself a disservice.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I learned with The Room is making a film is such a collaborative medium. I mean, you need everybody. You want everybody on board. You want everybody to be there for the film. Like, you don't want someone pushing their own agenda. You want them to be like, hey, we're here to make the best film possible, and how do we do that? And you can really alleviate a lot of problems with your team. You know, and I learned that with The Disaster Artist, and James Franco's spoken about this, where he was so thankful to have, Point Grey and Seth Rogen there to produce, to kind of guide and be like, hey, we don't need to do it in one day. We can take our time and set the scene up this way and bring in this actor and really take our time with it and do it right.
Well, but you're also working with a level of goodwill towards the project that I don't think Wood ever had. Right? Like the sense that everybody wanted to be part of The Disaster Artist.
I see what you're saying. So he had to kind of pull people into...
Yeah, Wood worked with the same people over and over again because they were the ones who would work with him, I think. And also, in the case of Lugosi and even Vampira and Criswell, he was offering them work. And
yeah, he did. So he did kind of create a band,
yeah,
in a way, which was cool.
Coming to him from outside that band. The Disaster Artist is, you say I'm making a movie about The Room, and everybody goes, ooh.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, you had a lot of people that just wanted to
and
do
it's
it.
Like the thing about the film is that about The Disaster Artist rather than The Room is that it feels like a party everybody's invited to. You can be part of it and enjoy it.
You're right. Well, what's interesting is The Room isn't accessible. Like the film that the book was about that I wrote wasn't accessible or relatable, but then the story behind the making of it was. Yeah. And that's how I feel very much with Ed Wood is when I think about Ed Wood, I think about Bela Lugosi, and I think him going to his house and then Bela Lugosi like trusting him, and that moment on the phone where he finds out that he passed away. Like those are the moments in Ed Wood that really move me rather than the filmmaking stuff.
Right. It's not about the movies he made. It's about the people involved. And that's the thing that Burton does so well is he builds the community of misfits and outsiders. I mean, it's basically a Wes Anderson movie before Wes Anderson started making movies. If that makes any sense. Like
100%.
This little enclave of people fighting their own fight against an industry that's indifferent at best and hostile at worst.
So what could Ed Wood have done to change his course? I mean, Plan 9, if Ed Wood's around now and Plan 9. Well, what could Ed Wood do as a filmmaker to get to the next level that he could, let's say, direct a Netflix show?
Yeah, I was going to say, if Ed Wood is around now, he's working for the Asylum. He's doing the knockoff stuff, Transmorphers or whatever they call them.
Okay.
There's a company that puts these out. I mean, they're based in the Valley. They make these cheap Atlantic Rim instead of Pacific Rim, that kind of thing. They find out what's coming. They make a movie with a similar title. And I think their business model's probably dying now because the whole point of that was putting them in Blockbuster. So people would think they were renting or kind of trick people into renting the cheaper version. They call them mockbusters, which is such a weird name. But I think Ed Wood would have been really happy in the 90s making those movies for the DVD market, like the late 90s, early 2000s. That was his window, strangely enough, like 30 years after he died.
That's okay.
We were ready for him.
I could see that. Yeah. So it's interesting for me when I analyzed the whole situation. So I watched Ed Wood. I loved the movie, and I saw the similarities with The Room and the low budget. These filmmakers that come in and just do it with no help. Like they just like, this is going to be my way. I'm going to pay for it. I'm going to fund it. You're going to do it my way. And then they get some traction. I know for me, when I saw this happening, I was like, I love movies. I want to be in movies. What do I do? And I noticed a movie like The Room is loved, even by people in the industry, but it's not a movie that's going to get you work. That's going to get me work as an actor, that people are going to be like, oh, he's in The Room and maybe we should bring him in for the show. It's not a movie like that. And a lot of Ed Wood's movies aren't like that either. They're just entertainment, but they're not like, executives aren't going to want to pull them and say like, direct this big movie, because they're looked upon as like, more of a joke entertainment.
Well, yeah. After The Room, did you start getting offers for a specific type of, like, let's get him, he was in The Room, and it'll be funny?
There were some random things that, you see, I started out, I moved to LA 20 years ago, and I was lucky to get an agent called Iris Burton who had repped Joaquin Phoenix and River Phoenix, and she had all the big child stars, and I kind of just I made up a story that I was in Patch Adams for 6 seconds, but I was like, I was supporting.
Right. Oh, you should have seen it before the final cut.
Yeah, and so they liked, I was 20. There was the look that they were going for at that time. They were casting a lot of the Dawson's Creek stuff, and I got in. I got a role in, a movie called Retro Puppet Master. Which wasn't very good. So I was auditioning. I was having meetings at Disney. So I was with a reputable agent. But like anything goes, you get a few things, and then that's that. And so when I did The Room, I had already had a taste of like what it's like to be part of the business, being with a good agent. The Room was more of a joke thing I did on the side because, obviously I mentioned it in the book, but I didn't expect it to go anywhere. So now we're back, 2009, and all of a sudden there's a movie you're in that people are seeing. So it's kind of confusing because it's like, oh, shouldn't you, like a lot of people are going to see this more than they're going to see the newest films. Like 1,000 people are lining up in LA to see it every month, and it's in New York, it's in Entertainment Weekly, and you're being like interviewed in all these big trades, but it still doesn't translate to mainstream entertainment. So what I looked at the situation as, very much like Ed Wood, I thought this story has like awards potential because of the characters. So I thought, instead of me trying to push this thing as an actor, which I don't think is going to happen, and more than that, it's not going to happen in a way that I'm passionate about, because I don't want to do reality shows. I don't want to do spoof convention stuff. I want to like make good films. And so I thought the story behind this movie is this generation's Ed Wood.
Yeah.
And that's what I looked at it as. And I was like, you got to go first rate. You got to work with somebody who's respected. And that's why I worked with Tom Bissell, who's a journalist who wrote about The Room in Harper's. And I told him, like I said, in our first conversation, he was in like Kazakhstan or something, like way out there. And I was like, this story, I want to be the next Ed Wood. He's like, I love that movie. And I was like, you got to get a first-rate publisher. You got to treat this as, it's nothing to do with The Room, the Plan 9, the B-movie stuff. You got to tell the story as if it's a nonfiction novel, a universal story that people will care about. They'll care about these two people, and it's nothing to do with a bad movie. Because I think then you limit yourself to that, and that's very much like what once Ed Wood started going, all of his stuff started getting the reputation of being like more crap, even though it's like he had a story to tell, the execution wasn't right. And so I learned with The Disaster Artist that the way to go around that is you gotta have a good team. We had incredible editors at Simon & Schuster who was like all on board to tell the best story possible, to put a cover out that people would, so you had a team behind you to do that. And so that's why I'm always curious, is Ed Wood somebody who's not willing to work in the confines of being told what to do in that way? Does he have to do everything himself? And I think that's where Bela Lugosi was at, is he had gone through the system, and he was like, you saw the result of what had happened. Well,
you've been chewed up and spit out.
Yeah, and so I think it was just refreshing for these two guys just to be able to tell stories without rules. And there's just certain filmmakers and creators that have a hard time working with rules.
And I think that's a really good point. I don't know that Wood could have worked with other people the way he worked with himself. Like that the way he functioned, his specific style, that kind of heightened level of dialogue where everything, the narration in Glenn or Glenda is, I think it's Glenn or Glenda, is just ridiculously ornate. This interior monologue that's actually an exterior monologue because it's a narrator rather than Glenn. It's so preposterously florid, but it's his impression of what an important man would sound like. And it tells you how he sees himself as self-taught and how little formal education there really was about that kind of filmmaking, and how he's carved out this idea of what a good movie is.
Yes.
And that idea isn't something that he could replicate. He gave us his version of it.
That's absolutely, and that's what makes it interesting, is that if it did have a watchable plot, then it would just be average.
Right, exactly. You as a viewer are responding to his version of the thing, right? And so you're connecting to him more directly. There's a line in the Cronenberg's version of The Fly about how the computer is giving us its impression of a steak. And Jeff Goldblum has to figure out how to teach the computer to love flesh so it can replicate it. And that's what happens, I think, in some of Ed Wood's moments in the movies he made. And that's the thing that Burton captures. You're watching someone filter an entire genre through his eyes, through his brain, and spit out something that isn't right, but that people respond to it in a different way, and it becomes memorable. In the film, in Burton's movie, the greatest strength, I think, is that he shot it in black and white and made it look...
It was a brilliant choice.
Yeah, because if it was regular Technicolor or whatever passed for that other process of the time in the 50s, when the movie is set, it would look really weird. And I think that was the first reason... I remember reading something somewhere where someone said, either seriously or not seriously, I'm not actually sure, but someone said, look, I mean, the black and white makeup, everybody would be green. You don't want to shoot that. Mm-hmm. You don't want that in color. And it was as simple as that. But also, of course, it lets Burton make the movie that he really wants to make about Ed Wood, which is just a little heightened, just a little surrealistic.
Which it needed, definitely.
Yeah, and it absolutely places him in a world where he makes sense. Right? Like the little pencil mustache and Johnny Depp's features in 1994, the little bird-like face and precise pointy nose.
Yeah.
And the way his smile has almost kind of fangs to it because he pulls his face back when he grins. It's already a little bit of a character bit. And without any makeup, like Martin Landau's wearing all the makeup for everybody. But Depp looks just as much like a weird little Gomez Addams creature, like a Charles Addams character.
Yeah.
And that sets us in their world from the get-go. And the score is a little weird with the theremin in there, and just the sense that we are embracing the world inside his head all the time. So, of course, his movies make sense, because we're already seeing the world the way he sees it.
Yeah.
And people understand him. You know, it's Scott Alexander and Larry Karaszewski's script is so sympathetic to him, but also quietly just moves the goalposts a little bit by having everyone understand him immediately. The only pushback he ever gets are from people with money and people who are gatekeepers, but that puts us on his side because he's an underdog and he has a vision, you just can't get it past. And that's what, when you're saying, like, how would he function within the studio system? He would never have functioned within the studio system, but he would have, like, he'd be the guy Charles Band gave $100,000 to now to make a movie.
Yeah, that would be perfect.
The Puppet Master thing makes perfect sense. That, of course, you would know that world. Like, that's
very much, yeah, just get it done in 5 to 7 days. We just want it delivered.
Yeah, here's a mansion. Make it in the mansion.
Even if you see the pole sticking out of the puppets, it's fine.
Yeah.
The strings. Just get it made.
The Full Moon Experience does exemplify a very specific type of cinema. Because again, I reviewed all of that stuff when I was coming up.
Now, see, they went a little different in Puppet Master 3. I felt like they
is that the one where they turned into good guys?
I'm not
sure. When did they introduce the Nazis?
I think in 3. But I think I thought they upped it the quality and the acting. I thought that was the best film, but I just think at the end of the day, like, they're just going to try to make it for as little as possible and as quick as possible.
Yeah, well, that was the Charles Band promise, right? Like, there's not just one subspecies movie. We're going to make 3 of them.
Yep.
And William Shatner might be in one, but he won't be in the other 2. It won't matter. We'll get someone else. The churn of those movies. And every week there'd be a new one. VHS tapes would just show up constantly. Paramount was their distributor.
Yeah,
and would just mail them out to us like a Nerf grenade that just kept pumping. You'd get one and then another, and every now and then one of them would be okay.
I'm more of the nature of, like, really taking your time and living a story.
Yeah, those
living the project. And but it's funny because when we Tommy and I went in for a meeting with a big literary agent who had just read The Disaster Artist and, like, saw it as a film and he was going to rep it, which was really exciting. And so I had Javier Bardem playing Tommy. Going in, that's what I thought of when I was writing the book, and so I went in there and I was like, what about an Ed Wood type film? And the first thing he said was, like, don't bring up that movie. It didn't do well for them. Yeah. And I thought, that's interesting. It didn't do well initially, but it's a film. It's such a respected movie.
Yeah, it never went away.
That won Oscars and that will live on forever. And so to me, I think even Ed Wood would prefer a film like that than some, like, commercialized, the black and white was a risk, but it made for a much better film. I think he would have preferred that outcome, and I think the audiences discover it. It's now a timeless film. Yeah, and I think to me that's a much stronger success than just like some comedy that would come out and that did well at the box office. I think the way they did Ed Wood was perfect.
Yeah, the lesser version of this film, I think, is the one where Bill Murray plays Ed Wood. And it's in color, and it's a comedy about a wacky guy who has crazy ideas. You know, like you've seen that movie a dozen times, a condescending take on him. Burton plays it straight. Like, he lets everybody else be real and dramatic, and the comedy is there. You know, nobody talks about Sarah Jessica Parker in the film, but she's great. Quietly wonderful, like in a really small way. She was able to find both the humanity and the confusion. You know, like, it's weird. I just saw Welcome to Marwen last night, the Robert Zemeckis film, which is god awful. Oh, is sadly, it? Yeah. It's the story of Mark Hogenkamp. It was made into a documentary called Marwen Call, like 8 years ago. It's incredible. It's the documentary, the true story, and the documentary. The way that the filmmaker Jeff Mellenberg tells the story, it's great. It's like legitimately wonderful, and you can see Robert Zemeckis seeing that movie, because Mellenberg is credited as an executive producer in his film, and thinking, oh, I know how to tell this story with digital effects and make the Barbie dolls come to life, and every decision is wrong, and it's ultimately just reductive and demeaning. And the one thing that works is Leslie Mann playing Hogenkamp's neighbor, who is basically doing what Sarah Jessica Parker does in Ed Wood, and I thought of it like a lightning bolt when it happened, when I was watching it. It's the compassion and the attempt to understand the other person. When someone presents you with something that you don't fully understand and almost can't believe, the revelation of this identity. And in Welcome to Marwen, it's the idea that Hogenkamp has not a secret life, but the way he's processing this horrific trauma that he endured is to create this elaborate fetishization of the world and to sort of take all the women in his life and make them Barbie dolls and act out lives for them. And she realizes that he's brought her into this world without her consent or even her understanding, and she tries to be sympathetic in exactly the same way that Parker is in Ed Wood. And I just thought, that's the one true thing. Like, that's the one thing in this movie that actually makes sense emotionally. And Burton tosses it off. Like, it's just part of the story. It's not, like, there's no huge moment. The orchestra doesn't swell. We're not led to understand and sympathize through her. We just see her being a person. Like, yeah, that's what you would do. You would try to be a good person about this situation that you just don't understand.
Yeah, most people don't even realize that she's in the movie, and she's great.
Yeah, and she's so good. I mean, everybody remembers Arquette because she's the more prominent character, but revisiting the movie, it's like, no, she's so good. Sarah Jessica Parker is so good in this little part. And Burton gives her the moment. Like, he gives her the space to do that, to find that character and play that role. And again, that wasn't a thing that I would have necessarily credited him for at the time, because he was doing these big, weird studio pictures, but they were all, with the exception of Edward Scissorhands, they were all really fast-paced and didn't have a lot of emotional content.
Yeah.
But then he found these tiny moments of humanity and then builds the larger relationship between Wood and Bella in such a smooth, assured way. He's never shown that kind of confidence since either.
Yeah, there's a lot of confidence because you're in black and white. People could laugh at it.
Yeah.
He didn't try to like mock their friendship. You really just felt for both of them in a way that had humor and had weirdness, but was just so beautifully done.
Yeah, it is such a strange, sweet little film in the middle of all of these big budget movies that he was making, and I feel even now. I know people said. I know he said Big Fish was autobiographical, but it still feels too much like a funhouse, like you get to play with the circus. And this movie doesn't. This movie feels like the little film that he carried around in his pocket forever. Even though he didn't, because that's the other thing. I found I was doing just basic research. I knew he was going to direct Mary Riley, the one that ended up being made with Julia Roberts and John Malkovich,
okay.
the Jekyll and Hyde story. Not very good. But he was going to direct it with Winona Ryder in the lead instead of Roberts, which might have been different. But he fell out with Sony, or Columbia Pictures at the time. He fell out with Columbia. It didn't happen. And he just flipped over to the Ed Wood script, which was at Disney. And
so there was an Ed Wood script that had been...
Alexander and Karaszewski had been working on it, I think, independently of him. He wasn't going to make it. It just happened that they said, we have this.
So it's interesting that they had been... an Ed Wood project had been going around, which was that because he had fans, or they just like the story, or do you know what?
I think Karaszewski and Alexander were doing things like The People versus Larry Flint, and they had come off They'd written Problem Child, I remember that.
Okay.
The John Ritter comedy. And they wanted to do
right.
other stuff. And they have a bunch of other scripts that were all sort of roughly based on real lives. And I guess, I don't know, I don't want to speculate, but I think it predates Burton's involvement.
Okay.
Because there would have been no point in commissioning them to write it at that point in everyone's careers.
So they just kind of looked upon like interesting personalities from
the last
couple decades, maybe, and
yeah, people who were sort of cultural outsiders, I guess. And I'm sure there's a third one, and I can't remember it now because I'm blanking on it. But Man on the Moon, the Andy Kaufman movie, that was theirs as well. And I don't know if that was commissioned after the fact because they wrote Larry Flint for Milos Forman, and he said, let's work on another picture about a real person. That makes sense,
yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Andy Kaufman was somebody who had that appeal from all the work he had done, but Wood was just so out there.
Yeah.
Which is surprising that they had been writing something about him.
Yeah, Ed Wood did not have a built-in audience that either Larry Flint or Andy Kaufman would have had.
Yeah, exactly.
In 1994.
And I think, it's kind of similar now with The Disaster Artist in a way where, when I pitched the book years ago, there's only one editor at Simon Schuster that knew what The Room was.
Really?
And they're the one that fought for it to get it made, to take on the book. And so it's kind of similar in that way. And then it reminds me of, of James Franco, who ironically was introduced to this whole thing by the book. He had never seen The Room. He had seen the billboard and thought
Rogan told me the story.
He'd never heard of
it, and they took him to see it in Vancouver.
Yeah, and so he was reading the book, and then he went to go see it, and he was just like, this is incredible. People are dressed up in tuxedos, and they're smoking weed, and he just saw there's something here that is being tapped into. But that's the only way that I think a lot of people found out now about this story, much like Ed Wood. And so I think it's these outsiders that have something to say and just don't know how to say it, and they just need help. And I think that's kind of the beauty of this whole thing is, you have someone like James Franco who knows what it's like to be an outsider, but has made projects that has made him an insider, and he's willing to help the other voices out there a lot like Tim Burton.
Yeah, it is a weird... the whole Ed Wood thing, the idea that now he's seen as a tragic figure, it's probably more to do with people seeing Burton's film than Wood's films. That kind of funhouse effect where you've come through the other side of it, and it's not that... I don't know that Franco's performance in The Disaster Artist overwrites what we know of Wiseau in The Room, but I did think that it found that third dimension of who he must have been making the movie. It feels like Franco figured out a way to be a person and a cartoon at the same time.
Yeah.
Which is who you see on the screen in The Room as well, because clearly this is a human being acting, but he transcends himself in that weird way, and becomes two-dimensional, becomes one-dimensional even in some scenes, and Franco reels it back in and makes it possible to see where the creative decisions come from and how you got there, how everybody got there in that movie. It's Ed Wood, the Burton film does the same thing for Ed Wood the man, I think. It shows you how he would have existed in the world, even though the world itself is a little broken already. Yeah. It's a surrealistic, realistic film.
Yeah.
And that casual exaggeration seems like it would have been who that guy was. We are in his head with him, so that at the very end, when he decides this is this is how I want to be remembered, this is my masterpiece, you can believe that it's an organic moment that he has built for himself, even if it is a delusion.
Yeah.
And the way that The Disaster Artist handles that moment for Tommy is that we get to see him decide. He doesn't convince himself, he chooses to go with it.
Yeah.
In a different way. So this deflates the question I always ask at the end of the podcast, which is, what, if anything, of this movie have you incorporated into your own work or borrowed from or leaned on? Because you basically created the answer film.
Yeah.
Without meaning to, because you started as a book. But
I think it just gets back to what I mentioned in the author's note is art is expression. Can it fail?
Yes, it can. I have seen movies where it failed. I just saw Welcome to Marwen. But please go on.
But I think that when you express yourself, it's just you never know what's going to happen. That's kind of the beauty of it. And I think that's what I learned with The Room as a young actor. I truly believed that this film would have no impact on anybody's life and that it was just a home movie that Tommy was making. And, 15 years later, 16 years later almost, I've been in Russia, I've been in France, I've been traveled all over the world, and there's just always people that show up to see this movie, and they're so excited to talk about it. They're so excited to bring their friends and watch their faces respond to the craziness. So that's the beauty of it. You never know when you make a film. But I guess what I learned through Ed Wood and through Tommy, if you're going to go out there and you're going to try, shoot for the stars.
Yeah. Also have a giant octopus around. How is there no giant octopus in... I'm going to decide that it's in the harbor. We just never see it. And all the shots of the San Francisco Bay.
It's there,
There's a giant octopus there.
Yeah.
So now we've connected them. It's a cinematic universe.
Yeah.
My thanks to Greg Sestero, whose new project with Tommy Wiseau, Best Friends, arrives on Blu-ray and DVD next Tuesday, January 22nd, from Lionsgate Home Entertainment in a 2-volume edition. So Volume 1 is already available to rent and buy on iTunes and Google Play. Volume 2 will also be available on those platforms next Tuesday. Thanks also to Peter Kaplowski. He knows what he did. You can find Greg on Twitter at Greg Sestero, all one word, and you can find Ed Wood on Blu-ray and DVD from Walt Disney Studios Home Entertainment. It's also available on iTunes and Google Play. Oh, and because this never happens, treat yourself. Look up episode 118 of this podcast where Jason Connery tackles The Room. It's available through the search bar at someoneelsesmovie.com, or you can find it wherever you found this episode. As always, you can find me on Twitter at Norm Wilner and elsewhere on the internet at nowtoronto.com. You can also find this podcast on Twitter at Semcast, S-E-M-Cast, and on the web at someoneelsesmovie.com, which I just mentioned. If you feel like leaving a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts or wherever you enjoy the show, that would be greatly appreciated. Every little bit helps, it truly does. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.
I'm afraid you're just too darn loud.